Thank you very much. So first of all, thanks for coming to my talk, and I'm really happy to be here at PyCon Canada. I'm originally from Toronto. I've been living in San Francisco for about 10 years, so it's really nice to be home, despite the snow. My talk today is called A Bossy Sort of Voice, and this talk came out of a couple things that were happening in my life around the time I started it about a year ago. And one of the things was I'd been working at that point in tech in the San Francisco Bay Area for about 10 years. I worked at a startup that IPO'd. I worked at a startup that definitely did not IPO. I worked at Microsoft at the time. And while I had some great experiences in tech and I really loved the work, I was definitely experiencing a lot of gender bias in tech. All the stuff you read about in the trade press was basically happening to me, and that was really hard to deal with. But I thought the hardest thing was just kind of the constant feeling of being disrespected and that being reflected in people's language. And a lot of the time when that happens to you, you sort of feel like maybe you're crazy or maybe you're being too sensitive. But it happened so much that it was really starting to wear on me. And around that time, my son got a Christmas present from his aunt, which was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. And he loves books, so we decided to read it to him at night before bed. And my sister-in-law was really keen on him reading this because she was very much into Harry Potter. So I'm a little too old for Harry Potter. I sort of just missed it. I was aware it was a phenomenon. I had seen the movies and actually fallen asleep during one. So I'd seen most of the movies. But yeah, so I didn't really have a great sense of the meat of Harry Potter. I just kind of knew it was a thing. And what was really interesting to me about reading Harry Potter was that the story wasn't really what I expected it to be. For anyone who is not familiar with Harry Potter, as I was not a few years ago, it's basically a story of these three kids, one of whom is Harry Potter, who go to a boarding school called Hogwarts, and it follows them from about age 11 to 17, and they're fighting the whole time a evil wizard named Voldemort, who comes back essentially from the dead to try to take over the world again and sort of rule over the wizarding world and harm the Muggle world, which is the non-magical people. And Harry Potter is apparently special because he's the only person who's faced Voldemort and lived. But Voldemort did kill his parents, so he's sort of considered to be the chosen one who's going to go on this quest to defeat Voldemort. And so he does this with his friends Ron and Hermione. That's my very quick summary of Harry Potter. They do okay. They save the world. But the interesting thing to me in reading it was his friend Hermione, to me, was sort of the hero of the books, even though Harry Potter is the primary focal point. And J.K. Rowling has said, she imagined this to be a little boy who went through this journey, this quest to sort of discover himself and save the world. But I really did feel like Hermione should be the main character. And part of this is because she always knows what to do. I mean, she figures out so many problems for them. She basically gives Harry instructions on what to do next. She is also the one who sets up the resistance to Voldemort, then lets Harry run it, which I didn't really get, but that happened. So she, to me, is a very central character in the books. And so this graphic sort of summarized to me sort of how I started thinking about the books. I don't know if you can read it or not, but there is one called Hermione Sets Up the Resistance, Hermione Makes Two Useless Friends, and my personal favorite, Hermione was right about that potions book the whole time, Harry. So yeah, this is how I thought of the books. But what was really disturbing to me about when I read it, and this is how this connects to my experience in tech, was that the way that the women in the books were described was not always very positive. The way that Hermione is described the first time we meet her, and it's the title of the talk, is having a bossy sort of voice. It's the top one there, lots of bushy brown hair and rather large front teeth. And these are just two more examples below of some of the ways that women are described in the books. And it really started to bother me, and I had that same feeling of, am I being too sensitive? Am I crazy? Like, this seems weird. But I did find I was skipping over some parts of the book. If you're a parent, you've probably experienced this. You're reading a book, and you see a line, and you're like, I'm not reading that. So I did that a few times while reading to him, and that really bothered me. This is a book my kid is learning from, and he's at a sort of formative stage, so that was kind of disturbing. So I did a very Hermione thing, which was do some research, because I thought I was nuts. It's not just me. There are people who've written about gender bias in Harry Potter. Most of those articles are basically saying there is gender bias in Harry Potter and critique other things like the representation of people who are not straight, the lack of non-white characters, etc. So it's an interesting area. All these books are really interesting, but what I found fascinating about it, and probably predictable though too, was that all of these books are written by literature scholars. So what they do is they look at a high-level framework for the broad theme across all of these books, and then they take all the examples they can and try to weave it into a narrative about their theory on this. And that's what they should be doing. But there was very little addressing of the language, and that was the thing that had bothered me the most. So occasionally I'd see like a sentence that I'd picked out that just didn't seem right, but it didn't really dig into it, and I wanted to dig into it. So this is once again where my background and my interest kind of came together, because realizing there's over 1 million words in all 7 Harry Potter books, I realized that combing through this, and trying to do it in a more quantitative way was not something a literature scholar was going to do. I don't know who would do that, so I figured it might as well be me. So that's what I did. Let me talk a little bit about the methodology. So when I first started to approach this, I thought, this is awesome. I'm going to treat this like this big machine learning classification problem. It's going to be great. I'm going to do all this complicated stuff. And really what I realized in doing this, and I did another project I presented at PyCon US a couple years back with a grad student in English Lit, was that you don't have to do really complicated implementations of code to find interesting things in text. So I'm going to explain how I approached it, which I think was probably a bit simpler than I'd originally planned, but I think still effective. So what I decided to make my hypothesis was that Hermione would be described in terms that were sort of detrimental to women, that were in ways that were very sort of stereotypically female and not necessarily very positive, like bossy, way more than Harry or Ron would be, or maybe exclusively. So I wanted to test that hypothesis. And what that meant was a couple things. So first of all, I wanted to focus on narration, not the dialogue. So I don't really care if there's like a horribly sexist character in Harry Potter. That's actually not what I was concerned about. It was more how J.K. Rowling was describing Hermione and other female characters, as we saw in those examples before. I wanted to concentrate on how their actions were described. So there's a little bit of description like the first introduction of Hermione where, it talks about physical characteristics or something like that. That does happen in these books, but it's way less frequent than verbs and adverbs are. There's a lot of description of their activities, and a lot of what I really found objectionable was stuff about screaming and screeching and being shrill. So I decided to focus on that, and I saw a lot more examples of that, so I thought that would give me more data. I also decided to compare only the 3 principal characters. So after spending about 2 hours trying to figure out how to get a comprehensive list of Harry Potter characters and scrape it, and then assign various characteristics to those things and what data structure to use, I decided that was a little bit much, and that I would start with something a little bit simpler. I have been fiddling around with how to do it for the bigger cast of characters, but there are quite a few, so I decided to give that a little bit of a rest and just focus on these 3. Also because these 3 characters are the most referenced in the books, so I also thought that was a good bet, and Hermione is definitely the most referenced female character, so that seemed to make sense. They're also comparable ages and stages of development, arguably, so that also made sense to me to use. Maybe I'm arguing that. Also important was keeping accessible to a broad audience. So I wanted to make sure I could give this talk in any track wherever I did it and be able to explain what I did. So another reason not to do anything too wild on the coding front. So there were 3 steps I used to analyzing the text. If you want to follow along, you can go to that URL, and there's a blog post that links back to a Jupyter notebook, and you can look at all of the things I did. I'm not going to show a ton of code, but I'm going to explain the process that I used to analyze the text and give you visual examples, which, if you want to learn more, you can look at the Jupyter notebook, but I'm not going to bore you with the code. So what I did was first get the text in a format that Python can read, Makes sense, right? Second, isolate the parts of the text we needed to analyze, so that narration versus dialogue thing. And then finding and summarizing the relevant words, which was a little bit more complicated than I originally thought, and I'll explain why. And so what I'm going to do too, as I mentioned, I'm not going to show you a bunch of code. I'm going to talk through an example. So this is the text I'm going to use. This is from The Philosopher's Stone, which is the first book we read together. And what I like about it is that it's got a mix of dialogue and narration in it, and it's got a selection of verbs, but it's short. So that's why I picked it. And you'll see in a moment how it was transformed through the course of this. So first of all, getting the text in a format Python can read. So this is the most straightforward part, basically taking a TXT file, which I got somewhere on the internet, of each of the books, and turning it into a giant string. Pretty straightforward so far, right? Then what I did was I tokenized it. I used the Natural Language Processing Toolkit to do this, NLTK. They've got a function that does this. It's awesome. You could roll your own too. I get asked a lot of why I didn't use Spacey. Spacey's a great library. This was just easier for my purposes at the time, but you could totally have used Spacey as well to do this. So that's what it looks like. So it just takes that string and splits it out word by word and with the punctuation. Now you might be asking yourself, wait a second, why didn't you take out the punctuation? That's sort of a normal thing you do when you process text. Well, the reason I didn't take out the punctuation was that I wanted quotes, because fortunately English is a very irregular language, but fortunately dialogue is always in quotes. So that was a great way for me to split the narration from the dialogue. So that's why I kept the punctuation. So next I had to isolate the parts of text I wanted to analyze. So what I did was I used those quotation marks and wrote a function that basically split out everything between quotation marks into one giant list, and everything that wasn't between quotation marks into another. So that was this narration list down at the bottom here, so that's what I actually analyzed. Then what I did was I put this in a dictionary, and the way I did this was a little bit conservative, and I was a bit conservative through the whole process actually, just to make sure I was honing on the right things. So what I did was, with every part of text in that narration list, if it mentioned the character at all, Harry, Ron, or Hermione, I would put it in their dictionary. So you will see that the first line, Harry looked at Ron, is duplicated in both Harry and Ron. I'll explain why in a moment, but I just wanted to make sure I got every single instance of how the character was referred to. So yeah, so there's the dictionary. It's got the keys are the names of the protagonists, and the values are just a big list of all of the narration that invokes their name. So there are your keys. So what are we going to do with this? Well, what I did with this was I used another function in the NLTK library called position tagging. And what that does is it basically looks at the text and tries to ascertain what part of speech you're looking at. So noun, verb, adverb, adjective, etc. So that's, whoops. No. Slide fail. So that's what I did with that. So you can think about that while I get back to where I was. There we go. Come on. All right. So the next thing I did was use that position tagging function, and what that does is it, like I said, it takes every word and discerns the part of speech, so it actually gives you a tag in that tuple. So I don't know if you can really see it on the screen, but it does basically this Harry, noun, looked, verb, etc. So it does that for every word in your text. And so what I wanted to do with this, as I mentioned before, I wanted verbs and adverbs. I really wanted to get to how J.K. Rowling was describing what the characters did. To do that, I needed to look at some of the patterns in her language. So also, fortunately, she writes in a pretty conventional way, so this wasn't too hard. But there are basically 4 patterns that you will see. You'll see a verb, then a verb, noun, and adverb, a noun and a verb, and a noun, verb, and adverb. And so those are some examples of that. You might wonder why I didn't use pronouns like he or she, and the reason for that was that I was never too sure if that was referring to one of these protagonists or not. So that's another way my analysis was really conservative. I only grabbed the data when their name was attached to it, just in case I made a mistake with the pronouns. But I was looking for these patterns. So what I did was write a function that would look for each of those nouns, Harry, Ron, or Hermione, and look for these patterns of words around it using those tags I showed in the last slide. So, like I said, I started with that, protagonist narration dictionary. And so this is an example, just illustrating what I just said, of finding nouns and verbs in this particular example. So basically I took all of them. So anywhere where I saw that pattern, I would grab that and pulled it out into another dictionary, where once again the keys are the names of the protagonists, and then the values are lists of all of the verbs that applied to them in the text snippet there. So those are highlighted in different colors because, remember, part of my hypothesis was that I wanted to see how Hermione was described differently than her two friends. So what I wanted to do was find the words that did not overlap, the the adverbs and verbs where only Hermione was described that way, or only Ron or only Harry was described that way. So in this particular case, looked and muttered fit the bill in this little bit of text. So those went into a new dictionary that summarized all of those unique words. So in this case, for example, Hermione has said as one of her verbs, but because Harry said something too, she doesn't get anything in this protagonist unique dictionary. So that's what I did. That's how I isolated those verbs and adverbs that were only used to describe each one of these three characters, with a particular focus on how Hermione was described. So what did I learn? Well, what NLP analysis would be complete without a word cloud? So brace yourself for some word clouds. I made word clouds for every one of the 7 books, which I'm going to show you here. Now, these are a lot of words, and I have these up online if you go to that URL if you want to peruse through them, and you can run the notebook yourself and get them yourself if you want. But there are a couple of things that emerged for me looking at this. One of them was there were some words that were only used to describe Hermione that really weren't objectionable at all, or or typically used to describe women in a negative way. For example, suddenly, pretty neutral. So I did see that, and again, this is across all 7 books, so it's just saying in book 5, Hermione was the only one who was described as doing things suddenly among those 3 characters. But I did see in a few cases some things that weren't great. So if you look over at number 1, shrieked is quite large, and the size, I should also mention, reflects the frequency. So if a word is big, it was pretty frequent. So shrieked is really large, timid and cried. So this was the first book I read, so that sort of validated some of my impressions about it. And what I found really kind of disconcerting was that there's some books where there wasn't really anything I had objections to, but there were some where it was a little bit more intense. And it kind of bothered me too that there are things like screaming is something Hermione does, but really, like, they're all in this frightening situation. Hermione's really one of the bravest characters in this whole story, and she's the only one who's screaming, whereas Harry and Ron yell a lot, for example. So that was a little bit unfortunate, and I'll talk a little bit about book 7, which was especially depressing to me in just a moment. Spoiler. But then you might be asking, well, that's great, Eleanor, but what about Harry and Ron? Like, how are they described? What words did J.K. Rowling use to describe them? So what I found about that was actually, I think, very telling in what this means. So I made a table of my findings. So across the top here, you've got the 7 books, and then down the side, of course, the 3 characters, Harry, Ron, and Hermione. And this table shows all of the words that were used to describe only that character in each book, with the frequency. So at this point, you might say, oh, the frequencies are kind of low. That's true, and that's because I was really conservative, and keep in mind, in a lot of ways, remember how I mentioned before, but also keep in mind that these are the words that are only used to describe these characters in each book. So that's why the frequencies are low. But I still think they're telling because they really reflect the role of the character in the story when you think about it. So for example, Harry has a lot of words unique to him, describing his actions, verbs and adverbs once again, that are really indicative of him being the main character. And here's why I say that. A lot of his inner self is reflected in these words. So words like thought, felt, wondered, These are a lot of his his internal world. And that really makes sense because J.K. Rowling wanted to write these books from his perspective. She said that many times. She envisioned this character that would really be about like his story. So that to me makes a ton of sense and is really reflecting the reality of the character in the book. For Ron, so Ron, I don't know how many people here have actually read the books or seen them. Okay, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So Ron is interesting because a lot of the words that describe him are very indicative of grouchy Ron, right? We all know how grouchy Ron is. So he does a lot of things like grunting is up there, moaning, bellowing, that really invoke his grouchiness. And that's the role that he plays in the books, right? So for Hermione's words are a lot more indicative of behavior that's usually attributed to women, especially in stressful situations, crying, screaming. Also to the way that she communicates. She's described as shrill quite a bit. She squeaks and squeals. I don't know how many of you have kids, but as I recall from my babysitting era, as well as being a parent myself now, like 11, 12-year-old boys squeak and squeal a lot. So I really don't think that should be unique to her, right? And she's 11 in that one. But the one that really was frustrating, remember how I said book 7 kind of depressed me? So in book 7, Hermione is a leader of the resistance that she told Harry to lead for some reason, once again, weird. But she's like a primary character, and she's out there fighting these evil wizards and saving the world. And the #1 word that was unique to her in that book was squealed. I was like, come on. So she does things breathlessly. Shrilly is on there as well. So that to me was frustrating. Like it's not that these are I don't know, they're not serious words in a lot of ways, but they are words that do convey that sort of subtle implication of women being weak or women being inadequate in some way. So that really bugged me, that was there, especially in that book. So why did I do all of this? You might be thinking, wow, that's really interesting. I've had a lot of feedback from these talks that have where people have told me, hey, I really always thought Hermione was treated differently, and now I'm kind of wondering, like instinctively I felt that when I read the books, and now I'm kind of thinking maybe this is why, and maybe I wasn't crazy about that. So I do get that feedback a lot, but I can definitely see a critique of this here, which is, well, that's just a few examples, across these books, it's only these 3 characters, like there's not necessarily, Eleanor, maybe you're being a little too sensitive that shrill is a problem. If that's your takeaway from this talk, that's also fine, because my main takeaway from the talk is not Hermione is portrayed unfairly. That's actually not the main takeaway I want you to have. The main takeaway I want you to have is how subtle this is. And that even though it doesn't happen a lot, it happens enough that I noticed it, and like I said, I've had people come up to me after talks and say, I've noticed it too. So I think what that means, first of all, is a couple things. It is that as Python practitioners, we've got a lot of great tools, even more complex and nuanced than this, to sniff out this kind of bias. So part of the point of this talk is sort of a call to action. There's stuff way more serious than Harry Potter going on with language and bias, and that we've got the tools to find that. So I would encourage everybody with an interest in NLP to start thinking about that and thinking how you can use those tools to point out bias and eradicate bias. The other one, though, is just to sort of remind everyone, there is very coded language that we use really casually. These are some examples I've put up on the slide, but just to think about in your overall interactions in making this a better industry for everyone, how we use these words and words like them. Because again, as that analysis showed, it doesn't have to happen a lot, and it doesn't have to have high frequency or be a slur, but it is noticeable for people who come from groups where these words are applied to in a not positive way. So I would just ask that you think about that when you have interactions with people. So that's my talk. If you are interested in learning more, like I said, you can go to that URL. It has all of the code there that you can play around with. You can submit other books. I get a lot of questions like, could I analyze another text with this? You absolutely can. You just have to change some of the names and the file that you're reading in, but that's pretty straightforward to do. So definitely encourage you to do that if you're interested and you want something pre-built. There's also a blog post that outlines all of this. So if you're interested in reading more, that goes into a little bit more detail about how the code was done. So if you're interested in reading more and don't want to read actual code, you can totally look at that. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and have a great morning. Thank you.